We are continuing in our parable series as Jesus teaches. And it's kind of funny, maybe it's just the way that I'm reading these things, but I'm kind of gathering that while there's different topics and while there's different points here, they all kind of boil down to the same things. Today we're reading out of Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. And it's the parable of the workers in the vineyard. And it's all about fairness. And life isn't fair. From chapter 20, it says, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. And a denarius is a day's wage. About 9 o'clock in the morning, he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. And he told them, 'You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you what is right.' So they went. He went out again about noon and about 3 in the afternoon and did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon, he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, 'What have you been standing here all day long doing nothing?' 'Because no one has hired us,' they answered. He said to them, 'You also go and work in my vineyard.' When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, 'Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first.' The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came in, and each received a denarius. So when those came who were hired first, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. 'These who were hired last worked only 1 hour,' they said, 'and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the work of the heat of the day.' But he answered one of them, 'I am not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous? So the first will be last, and the last will be first.'" Life isn't fair. Now, a day's wage is one thing, right? If somebody got hired and got paid the same thing you did for 1 day, it would be upsetting maybe, but not that big of a deal. But what if you were hired in January and you had agreed to a salary of, we'll say, $60,000 for the fun of it, and somebody was hired in June, and somebody was hired in December, but all in the end of the year, you were paid the same amount of money? You would think that would be unfair. And while in some ways you're right, what happens in this story is you agreed to something, and you are fairly compensated based on what you agreed to. This owner of the vineyard hired people all throughout the day. And he paid them all the same amount, and all the same amount as though they had worked a full day. Now, I've seen a couple of different ideas of why or how you interpret this parable. One person said very clearly this has nothing to do with your place in heaven and in eternity. And another person, that was his main point of the whole sermon. So I think as we are interpreting this message, we can kind of take it in a multitude of ways. If we look at it as eternity, there are people that are saved from young age. I grew up in the church. I never really lived a life outside of the church. I don't have the testimony of the person who did all sorts of wrong things and came to Christ later on in life. I have a pretty benign testimony, if you will, and sometimes that's kind of internally, at least, looked down upon in a certain way because people like that story of how they came to Christ and how Christ fully changed them. But then there are people who come to Christ in their early 20s, and they live their life, and my dad kind of was that way. He was in high school, and he was saved by a friend from high school. Or there are people that live their entire life completely in the wrong, never getting married, never sleeping with whoever they feel like, and they come to Christ at their deathbed. And if we take this parable as kind of meaning in that way, there are people that would say, well, I have been saved my whole life, and I taught Sunday school in church, and I offered all my time, and I gave of everything that I had to the church. Why is it fair that this person is going to receive the same grace that I am going to receive? And that's where we have to understand the meaning of grace. So justice, something that we don't necessarily want, is getting what you deserve. And this is where I come back to, it seems like all these messages come back to the same things over and over and over again, the same core principles over and over and over again. Justice is getting what you deserve. So if we go through life thinking, oh, we're just great people, and we deserve heaven, well, then we've missed the point. So we don't want justice because not necessarily that we're all terrible people, but we're sinful people. And sin is a separation from God. So on our own merits, even if we are giving of our time and attending church every weekend and teaching in Sunday school, we still don't deserve heaven on our own rights. Mercy, one of the similar type words, is not getting what we deserve. We all love mercy. Even though we are separated from Christ through sin, Jesus came and died mercifully for us. And then there's grace, getting what we don't deserve, and that's heaven. A relationship with Christ is what we don't deserve. But that's on the surface level. If we're that person who has gone through all of our life, I've heard many people, I don't know these things for sure, but let's just pretend for a moment that somebody like Adolf Hitler on his deathbed actually changed his heart. Obviously, I don't believe that happened, but is that possible? Is it possible that somebody who lived a life as despicable as Adolf Hitler could enter the gates of heaven because he had a complete change of heart. And is that fair? I think that all of us would say no, right? Through this story, people are brought into the workforce. People are, that still happens today. Not quite as much, but in the union halls, in the construction areas, you can work for a company and then the next day they let you go and you pick up with somebody else. And in this day, the vineyard owners didn't have a normal farm hands. So they would actually just go out, and this was normal. But it probably wasn't so normal that they would go out multiple times through the day, and especially in the last hour, because they quit at 6 o'clock, and he brought somebody in at 5 o'clock. But what's very interesting is at the end, he goes to pay the people. And I can imagine the people who were there at 6 a.m., who were getting paid last for the day. I can imagine that as the landowner brought in the person who came at 5 and then 3 and noon, and he started giving them a full day's wage, that they were starting to get excited. Well, I was promised a denarius, but since he's paying this guy a denarius, I bet you I'm getting 2 denarius. And I can also imagine that as they started giving out a denarius to each level, moving up, that their excitement quickly turned upside down. The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came and each received a denarius. So when those who came were hired first, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. And they started to grumble. They started to call out the landowner for being unfair. We've been here the entire day in the hottest parts of the day, and you're not going to pay us more? We deserve more. But the landowner changed the whole story, because he answered them and he said, I'm not being unfair to you. In fact, in many ways, he was being unfair to the people who worked less time, if you want to look at it that way. But he paid exactly what the first people expected. A lot of times here on earth, we like to compare ourselves to other people. And this is where we can start to bring up this idea of fairness. But even grace, in many ways, is not fair. The grace bestowed to us good people who attend church, who believe in God for most of our lives, is maybe a little bit less so than the person who has committed crimes and not followed along with God until later in life. The grace bestowed upon them is greater because it covers a deeper part of sin. But that's where the understanding of sin comes into that whole picture. God says that sin, no matter whether it's a lie or murder or adultery or what have you, a sin is a sin is a sin is a sin. And if we allow ourselves to start to believe that our sin is not what's really separating us, therefore we don't need the grace of God as much, that's where we can start falling into that trap. We can also look at this in a slightly different light, and that is, life in general is not fair. Salvation is about the end of our life. Certainly it affects, the time that we have on earth, but salvation is about the end of our life. We live in a world that just isn't fair. The Worth family losing Tim at 62. My sister had cancer. And we can start to look at these different things. And we realize that no matter how good we are or how bad we are, life is still going to happen. And the more that we compare ourselves to others in this world, the more that we're going to fall into that rut. When we look at the life that Jesus lived, he's the only person, God person, that ever walked the earth and was blameless. And if life was fair, he wouldn't have had to give his life on the cross. But he chose to. He chose to come and show people who he was, to create these miracles, to teach in ways that help us to understand amazing spiritual truths in ways that turn our perspectives. At my company, the construction company I work for, we work at prevailing rate. And prevailing rate is wonderful. That's why I work there. Each and every job that you do has a slightly different rate, and you put your time in based on that. Well, the only thing that prevailing rate doesn't cover, and it seems like it's just slipped through the cracks, is there's something called supervision. Supervision is where I am overseeing the job, and if I'm not actually physically installing a bathroom or installing studs or insulation or drywall or finishing or painting or flooring, then they can pay me my supervision rate. For my company, for the most part, we don't really pay supervision rate because we're working supervisors. But there are jobs that are really completely subbed out. So I've got a job right now in Canandaigua that it's an entire electrical job, and we need electricians because I can wire most of a house, but we're talking transformers for high voltage wire. There's really not a whole lot of work involved in that, so I will make supervision rate. Well, supervision rate is not regulated by the state. So I will be making, if I have guys from my employee working for me, and I'm in supervision, I'll be making less than half of what they're making to install something. Now, for the most part, again, we don't make supervision rate very often, so it's kind of one of those things where it's like, well, a couple hours a week, it doesn't really matter. But nonetheless, that conversation still happens. And nonetheless, that part of me says, but I should be making more because I am taking on the responsibility of this whole job while they're just doing their part. And at the end of the day, it all boils down to money. Am I making enough money to make this worth my time? I know of people that will have a job, they love their job, but this other job, maybe it's less convenient, maybe it's whatever, farther away, but it pays another couple $1,000s a year. So they'll leave their job because they need that extra money. And if that becomes our concentration, if that becomes everything that we're looking for, then this is what this is saying. We're missing the point. There's going to be things in life that are not fair. There's going to be things that pop up, and we're going to be treated well, right? A story that I'm bringing up tomorrow at Tim's funeral is that he won a Jeep Liberty, some of you might remember that, out of a vending machine. He bought a candy bar from a vending machine. He was spotted by whoever people, and he won a Jeep Liberty. And this was many years ago. And so you can be happy for that person. That's awesome that he won a Jeep Liberty. Or we can say, why didn't I win a Jeep Liberty? How come I have to be in the supervision role? How come I have to be overseeing this job when I could just show up and do my job and make more money? In my situation, at work, you might make less money in that hour, but the trade-off to that is the company is trusting you. The company is allowing you to run a job, and they're putting their faith and trust in you through that. So there are other benefits that come out of that. These workers that came to the vineyard and worked, the ones that came at 6 in the morning may decide never to go back and work for this landowner again because they felt victimized by the landowner. But the reality of it all is that it's by grace that we're all saved. And grace is not fair. But our relationship with God is the one that we're supposed to look at. Our relationship between us and Jesus. We don't need to concern ourselves and compare ourselves to our brother or sister next to us. And if we can have this attitude that we understand that life is not going to be fair, then it allows us to walk through life a little bit easier. The landowner answered him, I am not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious of me because I am generous? It's too easy to look at the person next to us and be envious of what they have. But when we go into these situations in life, we look at ourselves. Be true to ourselves. Be true to who we are. Accept the grace that's been given to us. There's always going to be something that we can focus on that's not fair. And we can choose to look at our situation and realize it's unfair that we are able to go to heaven, but yet the grace bestowed upon us through Jesus is exactly what we need in the situation that we are currently in. And that is enough. It is enough that just our own relationship with Christ is what matters in our life. And that opens our heart. It opens our life to being appreciative of everything we're given and not looking at the other pieces as unfair. Because even though somebody may have worked less hours or whatever, we're still given what we were promised. That Jesus will always do. The first will be last, and the last will be first. We go through life. We keep our eyes on Jesus. There's always going to be things that pull us away. There's always going to be things that knock us down or we need help to get through. But no matter what in the situations we're going through at the very moment, we keep our eyes on Jesus. We'll be able to move forward and continue in the grace that he has given. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I just thank you for today. And we just thank you for your grace. When we start to understand how undeserving that we are, not because we're bad people, not because of anything that we've done, but because we start to understand that we're sinful people. As good as we possibly can be, we're still sinful people. The desires of our heart are still there. But yet, even while we were still sinners, you sent your Son. And he came and he walked the earth as a blameless person. He extended his grace out to each and every one of us. That through a relationship with you, we could be saved. So while we're all going to run into situations that are unfair, we ask that you help us to keep our eyes on you, to set our hearts in the right direction. This world needs loving people. This world needs to see your light. And if we're always concerned with what our brother or sister does, we can't effectively show your light to the world. So we just ask that you come into our hearts in that way. The grace that you have bestowed upon each and every one of us. And that you help us to become better children of God through that. In your name, amen.